He suspected his maid was stealing from him. For 3 weeks, he watched her sneak out with bags she didn't bring in. So one night, he followed her, ready to catch her in the act. What he discovered left him speechless and shattered everything he believed about success, about wealth, and about the woman who had quietly served him for 9 years. Lawrence Anderson was 41 years old and owned real estate across America. He noticed everything, every number, every detail, every inconsistency, except the woman who cleaned his home. Her name was Grace Dinkins. She'd been with him for 9 years. Arrived before dawn, left after sunset, spoke only when necessary. Her uniform was always spotless. Her posture was always straight. Her eyes were tired in a way Lawrence couldn't quantify. She was just there, quiet, faithful, invisible, until 3 weeks ago. Lawrence noticed Grace leaving his Evanston lakefront home at night carrying heavy grocery bags. Bags she didn't arrive with that morning. It kept happening. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Same bags, same time. His mind went dark. She's taking something. He ran an audit. His office, his pantry, his wine cellar, his safe, nothing missing. But those bags kept appearing, and the question burned. What's she hiding? So on a damp October evening, rain slicking the sidewalks and streetlights glowing amber, Lawrence decided to follow her. He left work early, parked down the block, waited. When Grace walked out, coat pulled tight against the weather, bags weighing her down, Lawrence's chest tightened. Tonight he'd know the truth. She boarded the Purple Line heading south. Lawrence stayed 2 cars back, briefcase in hand, heart beating harder than he expected. She transferred downtown, exited near Bronzeville, walking east past historic brownstones and boarded storefronts. Neighborhoods Lawrence Anderson Development had acquired over the past decade. Buildings he'd renovated and repriced. Families he'd displaced without ever learning their names. Grace turned down a narrow street near 47th. She stopped at a converted laundromat with faded lettering that read, Second Horizon Outreach, Community Meals Tonight. Grace knocked. The door opened. Light spilled out. Lawrence waited, then followed her down. The basement was full of people. Homeless men wrapped in donated coats, tired mothers holding children, elderly veterans eating soup from paper plates. And there was Grace, hair loosened from its tight bun, apron tied over her uniform, standing at a stove, serving food, calling people by name, smiling in a way Lawrence had never seen. A teenage boy stepped up. Miss Grace, you got cornbread? Made it fresh, Byron. She handed him 2 pieces wrapped in foil. A little girl tugged her sleeve. Where does the food come from? Grace knelt down, her worn knees cracking. I make it with love, sweetheart, so you grow strong. Lawrence couldn't breathe. Those bags weren't stolen. They were given. Grace was using her own paycheck, her small wages from cleaning his 14-room lakefront home to feed people who had nothing. People his company had pushed out of South Shore, Bronzeville, and Woodlawn. People displaced by developments he'd approved in Chicago, St. Louis, and Nashville. She could have asked him for help, but she didn't, because after 9 years of working in his home, Grace had decided something about him. She didn't trust him with her mercy. Lawrence stumbled back up the stairs. Rain hit his face. He waited 2 hours in his car, engine off, hands shaking. When Grace finally came out, empty bags folded under her arm, slow steps on wet pavement, Lawrence rolled down his window. Grace. She turned. No surprise on her face, just quiet sadness. Mr. Anderson. Get in. She did. They drove in silence through streets. Lawrence owned but had never really seen. Then his voice cracked. How long? Grace stared out the window at passing headlights. 17 years, since my daughter died. Lawrence had sent flowers to that funeral. A generic arrangement. Never asked how Camille died. Never asked what Grace needed. Never asked anything. Why didn't you tell me? She looked at him, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. What would you have done, Mr. Anderson? Made it about you? Her voice was soft but precise. I wanted them to stay human, not your charity case. Something broke inside Lawrence's chest. He drove her to a small house on the south side, paint peeling, porch light flickering. He walked her to the door. Inside, through the window, he saw a frame on the wall. A military commendation. The Bronze Star, awarded to Sergeant Grace M. Dinkins for saving civilian lives during Operation Desert Storm near Kuwait City. The woman who scrubbed his kitchen floors every morning was a decorated war veteran, and he'd never asked. Before we go on, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me where you're watching from, because maybe this story found you today to open your eyes, maybe to heal something broken. Stay with me. What happens next will change everything. Lawrence didn't go home that night. He sat in his car outside Grace's house until the sun started to rise. Rain had stopped, the city was quiet, and all he could see was that medal on her wall. Civilian lives saved. How many? He didn't even know. He'd never asked her a single question about who she was before she started cleaning his home. When he finally drove back to his lakefront penthouse, the sun was breaking over Lake Michigan, amber light on cold water. The building let him in like it always did, security nodding, elevator waiting, smart glass adjusting to morning brightness, but this time, it all felt different. Cold, empty, like a machine pretending to be a home. Lawrence stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the skyline. His skyline. High rises with his company's name etched into steel and glass. Towers that had reshaped neighborhoods from Lakeshore Drive to Capitol Hill in Seattle. Projects underway in Austin, Savannah, Sacramento. But what had he really built? He thought about Grace. 9 years. She'd been there almost a decade. He remembered the day she was hired. His previous housekeeper had retired. The agency sent Grace. She arrived in a pressed uniform, references in hand, spoke clearly during the interview. Professional, competent, invisible. He'd never asked where she was from, never asked if she had family, never asked what she did before domestic work. She was just the woman who made his coffee, prepared his meals, kept his home spotless while he built an empire. But she wasn't just that. She was a mother who'd buried her only child, a veteran who'd served in combat, a woman who spent 17 years feeding strangers with money she could barely spare. And Lawrence had reduced her to someone who polished his countertops. The realization sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't lift. Lawrence heard the front door open, soft footsteps in the hallway. Grace was here, same time as always, 6:30 in the morning, quiet, faithful. He turned from the window and walked toward the kitchen. She was setting out his breakfast, coffee in his preferred mug, toast cut diagonally, fruit arranged on a porcelain plate. The same routine she'd done for 9 years. But this morning, Lawrence saw her differently. Her hands were thin, veined, worn from decades of work. Hands that had served soup to homeless veterans last night. Hands that had pulled civilians from burning buildings in Kuwait. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she said softly, not looking up. "Grace." She paused. Something in his voice made her glance at him. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" Lawrence wanted to say so many things. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to ask her why she never told him about her daughter, about the war, about the 17 years she'd spent feeding people he'd displaced. But the words caught in his throat like broken glass. "I'm fine," he said quietly. "Just didn't sleep well." Grace nodded, poured his coffee with steady hands, set the cup down gently on the marble counter, and Lawrence realized something that made his stomach turn. She was still calling him sir, still moving carefully around him like he was someone to serve, not someone to trust. After everything, after 9 years of working in his home, after her daughter's funeral, after countless mornings and evenings, she still didn't feel safe enough to be honest with him. He'd done that, built that wall between them without even knowing it, with his indifference, with his silence, with his complete failure to see her as anything more than help. Grace turned to leave, routine continuing, and Lawrence's voice stopped her. "Grace?" She turned back. "Yes, Mr. Anderson?" He looked at her, really looked, and saw a stranger. A woman with a whole life he knew nothing about. A decorated soldier, a grieving mother, a quiet saint feeding the poor. And he'd reduced her to someone who made his coffee and folded his towels. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "For everything." Grace's face softened just for a moment, a flicker of something human beneath the professional mask. Then she nodded. "Of course, sir." She walked out. Lawrence stood there alone in his spotless kitchen, in his lakefront penthouse worth $7 million, in his perfect empire built on numbers that never lied, and felt like the poorest man alive. He pulled out his phone, opened his calendar. Meetings packed into 15-minute increments, conference calls with investors in Denver and Portland, site visits scheduled for new developments in Boise and Oakland. His whole day mapped out with ruthless efficiency. But none of it mattered. Lawrence closed the calendar, opened his notes, and typed one question. Who is Grace Dinkins? It was the first honest question he'd asked in 9 years, and he had no idea what the answer would cost him. Lawrence couldn't focus. He sat in his office on the 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Grant Park, staring at contracts for a mixed-use development in Milwaukee worth $68 million. The words blurred together. Zoning variances, tax increment financing, projected ROI. All he could think about was Grace kneeling in that basement, handing cornbread to a teenage boy, telling a little girl that food comes from love. Lawrence left his office at 6:15, earlier than usual. His assistant, Ramona, looked up in surprise when he grabbed his coat and briefcase. "Leaving already, Mr. Anderson?" "Something I need to handle personally," he said, not looking back. The October evening was cold. Rain had started an hour earlier, steady and gray, turning Michigan Avenue into a river of brake lights and reflections. Lawrence drove north toward Evanston, parked 3 blocks from his lakefront home, and waited. At 7 o'clock, Grace emerged from the service entrance. She wore her usual brown coat over her uniform, white apron folded and tucked into her bag. In each hand, she carried heavy plastic grocery bags, vegetables and bread visible through the thin material. Her steps were slow, careful, like the weight was almost too much. Lawrence's heart pounded. He started his car and followed. Grace walked to the Davis Street station and boarded a southbound Purple Line train. Lawrence parked in a loading zone, left his hazards on, and sprinted to catch the same train. He entered 2 cars behind her, standing near the door, briefcase clutched in front of him like a shield. The train rocked through Evanston, then Rogers Park, then into the city. Lawrence watched Grace through the connecting windows. She sat near the front, bags resting on the seat beside her, eyes closed like she was trying to steal a moment of rest. She looked older than he remembered, tired in a way that went deeper than one long day. At Howard, she transferred to the Red Line. Lawrence followed, staying back, blending into the evening commuters. The train filled with people heading south, construction workers, nurses in scrubs, students with headphones. Grace sat in the same position, eyes still closed, hands resting on the bags like she was afraid someone might take them. The train passed through Uptown, then Lincoln Park, then the Loop. Lawrence's chest tightened with every stop. These weren't random neighborhoods. They were places his company had touched. Buildings bought, leases restructured, rents raised, families relocated to make room for luxury condos and boutique retail. At 47th Street, Grace stood. Lawrence followed her off the train, keeping a half-block distance. The rain had picked up. Water pooled in broken sidewalks. Streetlights cast amber halos in the mist. Grace walked east, past brownstones that had seen better decades, past corner stores with bars on the windows, past empty lots where buildings used to stand. Lawrence knew this area. His company had acquired 6 properties here in the last 5 years. Redevelopment projects, mixed use, market-rate housing. That's what the proposals called it. Displacement. That's what it actually was. Guilt flickered in his chest. He pushed it down. He was following a thief. That's all this was. Confirmation of suspicion. Nothing more. Grace turned down a side street. Narrower, darker, fewer working streetlights. She moved with purpose, despite the exhaustion visible in her shoulders. Lawrence stayed back, shoes splashing through puddles, rain soaking through his wool coat. She stopped in front of a low brick building, a converted laundromat by the look of it. Windows fogged from heat inside. A hand-painted sign above the door, letters faded but still legible. Second Horizon Outreach Community Meals tonight. Lawrence froze. A community kitchen, not a black market operation, not a storage unit full of stolen goods, a place that fed people. Grace knocked on the door. It opened immediately. Warm light spilled out. A man's voice, kind and familiar. "Miss Grace, we were starting to worry." "Traffic was bad," Grace said, her voice softer than Lawrence had ever heard it. "But I'm here now." She stepped inside. The door closed behind her. Lawrence stood in the rain, water dripping from his hair, his expensive suit clinging to his skin. He should leave, should go back to his car, should forget he ever followed her. But he didn't. He walked forward, stepped up to the door, hesitated. His hand hovered over the handle. What was he doing? What did he expect to find? Proof she was stealing? She wasn't. The bags were hers, bought with her own money, given to people who needed them. But he had to see, had to know. Lawrence opened the door. Warm air hit his face. The smell of soup, bread, something baking, voices inside, low and grateful. He stepped through the entrance, down a short hallway, and into a large, open room. Folding tables lined the walls. People sat eating from paper plates. Children, quiet and well-behaved. Elderly men with weathered faces. Women holding babies. Veterans in jackets covered with old military patches. And there, at the serving counter, was Grace. Her hair was down. The tight bun she always wore had been loosened. She'd taken off her coat, revealing the uniform underneath, but she'd tied an apron over it. She was smiling, actually smiling, ladling soup into bowls, handing out bread, calling people by name. A young man approached. "Miss Grace, you got any of that cornbread left?" "Made a fresh batch, Byron." She handed him 2 pieces wrapped in foil. He thanked her like she'd given him gold. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, tugged on Grace's apron. "Where does the food come from?" Grace knelt down, joints cracking, and looked the girl in the eyes. "I make it with love, baby. So you grow up strong." Lawrence couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was seeing. These weren't criminals. These weren't people gaming the system. These were families. People who'd lost homes, lost jobs, lost stability. And Grace was feeding them. With her own paycheck. With bags she carried on trains. With food she cooked in her own kitchen before coming to work at his house every morning. A woman approached Grace and hugged her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved us this week." Grace hugged her back. "That's what we do. We save each other." Lawrence backed toward the door, heart slamming against his ribs. The room swam, his vision blurred. He stumbled into the hallway, pushed through the exit, and stood on the rain-soaked sidewalk, gasping for air. The door opened, and Lawrence stepped into a world his money had erased. Lawrence stood just inside the doorway, water dripping from his coat onto linoleum that had seen decades of feet. The room was larger than it looked from outside. A basement space, low ceiling, exposed pipes painted white, fluorescent lights humming overhead. But it was warm. Not just temperature, something else, something Lawrence couldn't name. Folding tables lined 3 walls. Maybe 40 people sat eating. Paper plates, plastic spoons, styrofoam cups. The food was simple. Soup, bread, some kind of casserole. But people ate slowly, carefully, like they wanted to make it last. Children sat with coloring books someone had donated. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap ate alone in the corner, hands shaking slightly as he lifted his spoon. A woman in a hospital cafeteria uniform still wore her name tag, Keisha. She held a sleeping infant while trying to eat one-handed, and Grace was everywhere. She moved between the serving counter and the tables with an energy Lawrence had never seen in his home. Her hair was down, gray and curly, framing her face in a way that made her look softer, younger. The apron over her uniform was stained from years of use. Her movements were practiced, efficient, but gentle. She knew everyone, every single person. "Earl, you need more soup?" A man in his 70s looked up, nodded gratefully. Grace filled his bowl without him having to ask. "Shayna, how's your boy doing with that cough?" A young mother smiled, tired but hopeful. "Better, Miss Grace. That honey you gave us helped." Lawrence pressed himself against the wall, trying to stay invisible, trying to understand what he was seeing. A teenage boy approached the counter. Tall, thin, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big. "Miss Grace, I wanted to thank you. For the shoes last week. They fit perfect." Grace's face lit up. "I'm so glad, Deshawn. You keeping up with school?" "Yes, ma'am. Got a B on my history test." Grace reached across the counter and squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you, baby. You keep going." The boy walked away smiling, like that simple affirmation was worth more than the shoes. An older woman approached, moving slowly with a cane. She didn't say anything, just hugged Grace across the counter. Grace hugged her back, eyes closing briefly. When they separated, the woman whispered something Lawrence couldn't hear. Grace nodded. "I know, Ramona. We're going to be okay." Lawrence's chest felt tight. These weren't transactions. They weren't charity distributed with clinical distance. This was family. Grace knew their names, their children, their struggles. She remembered birthdays. She asked follow-up questions. She cared. And then Lawrence saw it, really saw it. The man in the corner, the Vietnam veteran, he looked familiar. Lawrence had seen his face before. Where? Then it hit him. A community meeting 3 years ago, South Shore. A redevelopment proposal. That man had stood up, microphone shaking in his hand, asking what would happen to long-time residents. Lawrence's lawyer had answered with practiced language. Relocation assistance, market-rate housing, transition support. The man had cried, said he'd lived in his building for 42 years, said it was the only home he had left after his wife died. Lawrence had looked down at his phone while the man spoke, checked emails, approved budgets, moved on to the next agenda item. And now that man was here. Eating soup Grace had paid for. Lawrence scanned the room. How many others? How many of these faces had he seen in community meetings, in displacement reports, in legal documents his company filed with the city? The woman with the infant. Lawrence recognized her too. LaToya. She'd submitted public comment, opposing a development in Bronzeville. Said she worked night shifts at Northwestern, couldn't afford the new rents, would have to move an hour away. His development director had dismissed her concerns. The project moved forward. A younger man, maybe 30, sat near the door. He wore a Marine Corps hoodie. His eyes were distant, haunted. Lawrence didn't recognize him specifically, but he'd read the reports. Veterans displaced at higher rates, fixed incomes, limited housing options, invisible casualties of economic progress. Grace had fed them all. With bags she carried on her back, with money earned cleaning Lawrence's 14-room lakefront home. With food she probably cooked in her own tiny kitchen before dawn, before coming to work for him. Lawrence felt sick. Those bags weren't stolen. They were bought. With her paycheck. Money he paid her. Money she immediately gave away to people his company had pushed into poverty. Grace was using his money to repair damage he had caused. And she never said a word, never asked for help, never confronted him, because she knew. After 9 years of working in his home, she knew exactly what kind of man he was. The kind who wouldn't care. The kind who would make it about himself. The kind who saw people as numbers on spreadsheets. Lawrence backed toward the door. Slowly, carefully. Grace was busy at the stove, stirring something in a large pot. She hadn't seen him. No one had noticed him. He was invisible here, just like Grace was invisible in his home. He pushed through the exit, stumbled up the stairs, and stood on the sidewalk, gasping. Rain hit his face, cold, cleansing, but it didn't wash away what he'd just seen. He walked to his car parked 3 blocks away, sat in the driver's seat, stared through the rain-streaked windshield at nothing. His hands were shaking, his throat was tight. His chest felt like something was collapsing inside it. Grace emerged 2 hours later. Lawrence watched her through the rearview mirror. She carried empty bags now, folded under her arm. Her steps were slower than before. Exhausted. She'd given everything she had. Again. Lawrence started the car, pulled up beside her, rolled down the window. Grace. She turned. No surprise on her face. Just that same quiet sadness, like she'd always known this moment would come, like she'd been waiting for it. "Get in," Lawrence said. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the door and sat down. The car smelled like rain and expensive leather. Her coat dripped onto the seat. She didn't apologize. They drove in silence. Lawrence didn't know what to say, didn't know how to ask the questions burning in his throat. Finally, his voice cracked. "How long?" Grace stared out the window. 17 years. Since my daughter died. Lawrence's hands tightened on the wheel. He'd sent flowers to that funeral. Never asked how Camille died. Never followed up. Never cared. "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace turned to look at him. Her eyes were tired but clear. What would you have done, Mr. Anderson? Made it about you? Turned them into your charity case? Her voice wasn't angry, just matter of fact, like she was stating an obvious truth. I wanted them to stay human, she continued. Not projects, not tax write-offs, people. Something broke inside Lawrence's chest. Clean, final, like a bone snapping. Those bags weren't theft. They were sacrifice. The next evening, Lawrence came home at 6:30, earlier than he'd managed in years. The house was quiet, lights on in the kitchen, the faint smell of lemon cleaner. He found Grace in the hallway outside his study, on her hands and knees, scrubbing the marble floor. Her movements were slower than usual, methodical but strained. Grace, you don't have to do that tonight. She didn't look up. It needs doing, Mr. Anderson. Lawrence set his briefcase down. Please, take a break. Grace sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. Her face was pale. Sweat beaded at her temples despite the house being cool. I'm almost finished. She reached forward to dip the scrub brush into the bucket. Her hand missed. The brush clattered against the tile. Grace swayed. Lawrence moved without thinking. Grace? She tried to stand, got halfway up and collapsed. Lawrence caught her before she hit the floor, her weight suddenly dead in his arms. Grace, Grace, can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered, opened briefly, unfocused. I'm fine, she whispered. Just need a moment. You're not fine. Lawrence lowered her gently to the floor, grabbed his phone, dialed. I need an ambulance. 2847 Sheridan Road, Evanston. My employee collapsed. She's conscious, but disoriented. Yes, I'll stay on the line. Grace's hand gripped his sleeve weakly. Mr. Anderson, please. I can't afford. Don't, Lawrence said, his voice harder than he intended. Don't even finish that sentence. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. They checked her vitals, asked questions Lawrence couldn't answer. How long has she been feeling ill? Does she have any medical conditions? Is she taking medications? Lawrence stood there useless, realizing he didn't know anything. They loaded Grace onto a stretcher. Lawrence rode with her to Northwestern Memorial, holding her hand in the back of the ambulance while a paramedic monitored her blood pressure. Grace drifted in and out, mumbling apologies. Sorry for the trouble. Sorry for the mess. Sorry. Lawrence wanted to scream. Instead, he squeezed her hand. You have nothing to apologize for. At the hospital, they took her straight back. Lawrence paced the emergency department waiting room for 2 hours, checked his phone, ignored emails, stared at CNN on the mounted television without processing a single word. Finally, a doctor emerged. Older woman, kind eyes, exhaustion written in the lines around her mouth. Mr. Anderson? I'm Dr. Vivian Keller. You brought in Grace Dinkins? Yes. Is she okay? Dr. Keller gestured toward a quieter corner. Miss Dinkins is stable now, but her condition is serious. She has advanced type 2 diabetes. Her blood sugar was dangerously high when she arrived. She's also severely anemic, likely from chronic malnutrition and inadequate iron intake, and her blood pressure is critically elevated. We're talking hypertension that's been untreated for years. Lawrence felt the floor tilt. Years? At least 5, possibly longer. Dr. Keller's expression hardened slightly. When was the last time she saw a doctor? I don't know. Does she have insurance through your household? Lawrence's mouth went dry. I don't know. She's been with me for 9 years, I assumed. He trailed off. Assumed what? That someone else handled it? That it wasn't his responsibility? We're admitting her for observation and treatment, Dr. Keller continued. She'll need insulin management, iron infusions, and blood pressure medication. Long-term, she'll need consistent medical care, dietary changes, and rest. A lot of rest. Can I see her? Room 314. But she's sleeping now. Let her rest. Lawrence took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Found room 314. Pushed the door open quietly. Grace lay in the hospital bed, IV in her arm, monitors beeping softly. Her hair was loose on the pillow, gray and thin. Her face looked smaller somehow, fragile. Lawrence sat in the chair beside the bed, stared at this woman who'd spent 9 years working in his home while her body quietly failed. Why didn't she say something? Why didn't she ask for help? But he knew why. Because Grace had spent 17 years putting everyone else first since her daughter died. Since she decided that other people's survival mattered more than her own. Lawrence pulled out his phone, opened a search engine, typed Grace Dinkins. At first, nothing. A few social media profiles that weren't her, an obituary for someone else with the same name. Then he added military, Grace Dinkins Military Service. The results changed. A scanned document from the National Archives, declassified after 30 years, Operation Desert Storm, logistics coordination, civilian evacuations near Kuwait City during air raids, commendation for exceptional service under fire. Lawrence clicked deeper, found a brief mention in a military history database. Sergeant Grace M. Dinkins, stationed with the 82nd Transportation Company, coordinated emergency evacuations of over 150 Kuwaiti civilians during chemical weapon threats in February 1991. No medals displayed publicly, no interviews given. Lawrence's hands started shaking. He searched her daughter, Camille Dinkins. Found an obituary from Baton Rouge. Camille Marie Dinkins, beloved daughter of Grace Dinkins and the late Howard Dinkins, passed away at age 26. Services to be held at Mount Zion Baptist Church. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the American Diabetes Foundation. Lawrence read it 3 times. Diabetes. Camille had died from diabetes, and Grace was now dying from the same disease. But Grace wasn't treating it, wasn't taking care of herself. Because someone else always needed the money more. He searched Howard Dinkins. Found a news article from Port Arthur, Texas. Refinery explosion. 3 workers killed. Howard Dinkins, age 34, identified among the victims. Survived by his wife, Grace, and daughter, Camille. Lawrence set his phone down, covered his face with his hands. Grace had lost her husband in an industrial accident, lost her daughter to a disease she couldn't afford to treat properly. Served her country in a war zone, saving lives, and spent the last 17 years feeding people displaced by Lawrence's empire, while he paid her barely enough to survive and never once asked if she was okay. The version of himself Lawrence had spent 41 years building, the successful businessman, the strategic investor, the respected developer, crumbled. What remained was something Lawrence didn't recognize. Someone who'd built wealth on the backs of invisible people. Someone who'd never looked closely enough to see the cost. Grace stirred in the bed, her eyes opened slowly, unfocused. "Mr. Anderson? I'm here." She tried to sit up. Lawrence gently stopped her. "Don't. Rest. I need to finish the floors." "Grace, the floors don't matter." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be trouble." Lawrence's throat closed. "You're not trouble. You've never been trouble. I'm the one who should be apologizing." Grace closed her eyes. A single tear ran down her cheek. "Someone else always needed the money more," she whispered. And Lawrence finally understood. What he'd found in those search results would destroy the version of himself he'd spent a lifetime building. But maybe that version deserved to be destroyed. Lawrence sat in that hospital chair until 3 in the morning. Grace slept fitfully, monitors beeping their steady rhythm. Every so often she'd murmur something. Names Lawrence didn't recognize. Camille, Howard, Byron, Shayna. People she'd loved, people she'd lost, people she'd saved. He couldn't stop thinking about what he'd found. The declassified reports, the archived commendations, the life Grace had lived before she ever stepped foot in his home. February 1991, Kuwait City. Grace would have been 28 years old, young, newly married maybe. The document said she'd coordinated logistics for the 82nd Transportation Company during Operation Desert Storm. Supplies, equipment, personnel movement. But that wasn't the part that haunted Lawrence. It was the civilian evacuations. When Iraqi forces retreated, they'd set fire to oil fields. Chemical weapon threats forced emergency protocols. Coalition forces evacuated foreign nationals and Kuwaiti civilians from affected zones. Grace had been part of that operation. Not behind a desk. In the field. Under fire. The commendation was brief. Clinical military language. Sergeant Grace M. Dinkins displayed exceptional courage and leadership while coordinating the emergency evacuation of 153 civilians from threatened zones near Kuwait City. Her actions under sustained hostile fire directly resulted in the preservation of life and upheld the highest traditions of military service. 153 lives. Grace had saved 153 people while bombs fell and oil burned and the world caught fire around her. And she'd come home, taken off the uniform, and never mentioned it again. No interviews, no medals on display, no pride claimed. Lawrence had walked past her every morning for 9 years and never knew. He thought about Howard Dinkins, the refinery explosion in Port Arthur, 1997. Grace would have been 34. Camille would have been 12. The news article was short. 3 workers killed when a storage tank ruptured during maintenance. Cause under investigation. Names of the deceased released pending family notification. Grace had buried her husband and kept going, raised Camille alone, worked whatever jobs she could find, and somehow still found time to volunteer, to serve, to give. Then Camille. Lawrence pulled up the obituary again on his phone. Read it slowly this time. Camille Marie Dinkins, age 26, passed away peacefully, surrounded by family after a brief illness. She is survived by her mother, Grace Dinkins. Camille was a devoted teacher, a loving daughter, and a faithful servant to her community. Brief illness. That's what they called it when someone died from something preventable, something treatable. Lawrence knew what that meant now. Diabetes. The same disease Grace was battling. The same disease Grace wasn't treating because she spent her money feeding strangers instead of buying insulin for herself. Had Camille done the same thing? Rationed her medication to pay rent? Skipped doctor visits to afford groceries? Died quietly while trying to survive in a system that priced her out of living? Lawrence felt sick. He looked at Grace sleeping in that hospital bed, IV pumping medication into her veins, machines monitoring her failing body. This woman had survived war, survived widowhood, survived the death of her only child, and she'd kept going, kept serving, kept sacrificing. No bitterness, no anger, no demands for justice or fairness or even basic acknowledgement, just quiet endurance, and love poured out for people who couldn't pay her back. Lawrence had hired people with Harvard MBAs who crumbled under deadline pressure. He'd worked with executives who fell apart when deals went south. He'd watched investors panic over market corrections that cost them a fraction of their wealth, and they all thought they were strong, tough, resilient. But Grace was stronger than all of them combined. She'd faced real loss, real hardship, real war, and she'd responded not with bitterness or retreat, but with more love, more service, more sacrifice. The strongest person Lawrence knew worked in his kitchen, scrubbed his floors, folded his laundry, and he'd never once asked her who she was. A nurse came in to check Grace's vitals around 4. Young guy, friendly, efficient. "She doing okay?" Lawrence asked. "Stable. Blood sugar's coming down. Blood pressure's still high but improving. She'll need to stay a few more days." "Does she have insurance?" The nurse checked the chart. "Doesn't look like it. We'll work with her on payment plans. Happens more than you'd think." Lawrence pulled out his business card. "Bill me directly. All of it. And make sure she gets whatever care she needs. No limits." The nurse took the card, read it, looked at Lawrence differently. "You're her employer?" "I am. And I should have done this 9 years ago." The nurse nodded slowly. "Well, you're doing it now. That's something." After he left, Lawrence sat back down, stared at Grace's face. Peaceful now, the monitors beeping steady. He thought about all the mornings she'd arrived at his house at 6:30, made his coffee, prepared his breakfast, cleaned his home, and then left every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday carrying bags of food she'd bought with money he paid her. Money she should have used for herself, for doctors, for medication, for rest. Instead, she'd fed people Lawrence had displaced, people his developments had pushed into poverty, people whose names appeared in reports he never read, in community meetings he never attended, in displacement studies his lawyers summarized into bullet points. Grace had looked at those same people and seen family, seen neighbors, seen human beings worth saving. Lawrence had looked at them and seen numbers, obstacles, Externalities. He pulled up his company's development history on his phone. Chicago projects over the past 12 years. South Shore, Bronzeville, Woodlawn, Pilsen, Austin. 63 properties acquired. 41 buildings redeveloped. Estimated displacement. He scrolled to the consultant's report. Conservative estimate suggests 720 households relocated as direct or indirect result of market repositioning initiatives. 720 households. Multiply by average household size. 2,000 people. Maybe more. 2,000 lives disrupted so Lawrence could add another tower to the skyline. Another development to his portfolio. Another zero to his net worth. And Grace had tried to heal that damage one bowl of soup at a time. One bag of groceries at a time. One act of kindness at a time. Lawrence set his phone down, put his head in his hands, and for the first time since his mother died when he was 7 years old, he cried. Not quiet tears. Real sobs that shook his shoulders and made it hard to breathe. Grace stirred. Her hand moved slightly on the bed. Lawrence looked up, wiping his face. Her eyes were open, watching him. "Mr. Anderson? I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Grace." She didn't ask what for. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she'd always known. She just closed her eyes again and let him sit there in his shame. And Lawrence realized the truth that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had never once asked her who she was. Lawrence left the hospital at 7 in the morning. Grace was stable, sleeping peacefully for the first time in hours. He drove straight to Bronzeville, parked outside Second Horizon Outreach. The building looked different in daylight. Smaller, more worn. Paint peeling from the window frames. The sign faded to barely legible. He knocked. No answer. He tried the door. Unlocked. Inside, the basement was quiet. Tables folded against the wall. Chairs stacked. The smell of yesterday's soup still lingering in the air. A man emerged from a back room. Older, maybe 60, wearing an apron. He stopped when he saw Lawrence. "We're not open yet. Dinner service starts at 6. "I'm not here for food," Lawrence said. "I'm here to talk." The man studied him. Suit, expensive watch, briefcase. "You a reporter?" "No, I'm Lawrence Anderson." The man's expression changed, hardened. Anderson Development. "Yes." The man crossed his arms. "What do you want?" "To understand," Lawrence said quietly. "To listen." The man stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "My name's Tyrell. I run this place. Well, Grace runs it. I just keep the doors open. Grace is in the hospital." Tyrell's face went pale. "What happened?" "She collapsed. Diabetes, anemia, untreated hypertension. She's stable now, but," Lawrence trailed off. "But she almost died because she spent her money feeding us instead of taking care of herself." Tyrell finished. His voice was tight. "That sounds like Grace. How long have you known her?" 17 years. She started coming here after her daughter passed. Never missed a Monday, Wednesday, or Friday since." Lawrence swallowed. "I need to meet the people she serves. I need to hear their stories." Tyrell considered this. "Why?" "Because I think I'm the reason they're here." Tyrell nodded slowly. "Come back at 5:30. Before dinner service, I'll introduce you." Lawrence returned at 5:20. The basement was filling up. People arriving early, taking seats, waiting patiently. Tyrell met him at the door. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure." Tyrell led him to a table near the back. An elderly man sat alone, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "This is Earl Whitcomb. Earl, this is Lawrence Anderson." Earl looked up. His face was weathered, eyes sharp despite his age. "Anderson. I know that name." Lawrence sat down across from him. "I know. My company displaced you." Earl's jaw tightened. 42 years I lived in that building. 42 years. Raised my kids there. Buried my wife from that address. Then one day, letter comes. Building sold. Rent going up 300%. 60 days to vacate. Lawrence felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't give me back my home," Earl said quietly. "But Miss Grace, she gave me something to hold on to. Fed me when I had nothing. Talked to me like I mattered. She didn't have to do that. But she did." Tyrell moved Lawrence to another table. A woman in her 30s, hospital scrubs, exhausted eyes. "This is LaToya Freeman. She's a nursing assistant at Northwestern. Latoya looked at Lawrence warily. What's this about? He wants to understand, Tyrell said. Understand what? Latoya's voice was sharp. Understand that I commute 3 hours each way because your company redeveloped my building in Bronzeville? Understand that I leave my kids at 5 in the morning and don't see them till 9 at night? Understand that I'm one missed paycheck away from losing everything? Lawrence couldn't meet her eyes. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, Latoya corrected. But Miss Grace knew. She watched my kids after school when I couldn't get home, brought them food, helped with homework. She saved my family. What did you do? Lawrence had no answer. Tyrell led him outside. A man sat in a car parked at the curb. Older sedan, back seat full of belongings. Tyrell knocked on the window. The man rolled it down. Reggie, this is Lawrence Anderson. The man stared. From Anderson Development? Yes. Reggie Holloway, Marine Corps veteran. Used to have an apartment in Gary. Fixed-rate lease. Building got bought out. New management tripled the rent. Been living in this car for 8 months now. Lawrence felt sick. Where do you go during the day? Library, park, wherever I can. Reggie's voice was flat. Served 2 tours overseas. Came home to this. I'm sorry, Lawrence said again, the words feeling more hollow each time. Miss Grace brings me food 3 times a week, Reggie said. Checks on me, makes sure I'm okay. She treats me like a human being. That's more than anyone else has done. Lawrence returned to his office at 8, told his assistant he wasn't to be disturbed, locked the door, opened his laptop, pulled up 12 years of development records, every property acquired, every building redeveloped, every displacement report filed with the city. He read every single page, every address, every household, every person relocated. The consultant reports were clinical. Displacement mitigation strategies implemented per municipal requirements. Relocation assistance offered in compliance with applicable statutes. Transition support provided within industry standards. But beneath the corporate language were names, families, lives, Earl Whitcomb, Latoya Freeman, Reggie Holloway, hundreds more, people who'd lost homes, lost communities, lost stability. So Lawrence could maximize returns for investors who'd never see these neighborhoods, never meet these people, never know the cost. By midnight, Lawrence's hands were shaking. By 2, he felt nauseous. By 4:30, he was staring at his reflection in the dark window, seeing a stranger. Someone who'd built wealth on invisible suffering. Someone who'd profited from pain he refused to witness. He pulled up financial projections for current developments. Savannah, Boise, Oakland, Sacramento. More properties, more displacements. More families pushed to the margins so Lawrence could add another percentage point to his portfolio returns. He opened a blank document, typed a single line. I take full responsibility for the harm caused by Anderson Development's displacement of over 2,000 Chicago residents between 2012 and 2024. He read it, added another line. No amount of apology can undo that harm. Another, but I can stop causing more. The sun rose over Lake Michigan, orange light on cold water. Lawrence sat at his desk, document open, hands still shaking. He'd spent the night reading the cost of his empire, the real cost. Not in dollars, but in lives. Earl, who'd lost his home of 42 years. Latoya, commuting 3 hours to keep her family together. Reggie, sleeping in his car after serving his country. And Grace, sacrificing her health to heal wounds Lawrence had caused. By dawn, Lawrence knew something with absolute certainty. Apologies weren't enough. Lawrence returned to the hospital at 9 in the morning. He hadn't slept, hadn't showered, still wore yesterday's suit, wrinkled and coffee-stained. Grace was awake, sitting up in bed, eating hospital oatmeal with slow, deliberate bites. She looked up when he entered. Mr. Anderson, you look terrible. I need to talk to you. Grace set down her spoon. All right. Lawrence pulled the chair closer to her bed. Sat down. His hands were still shaking from the night spent reading displacement reports. I went to Second Horizon yesterday. Met Earl, Latoya, Reggie. Grace's expression didn't change. I see. They told me their stories. What happened to them. Where they used to live. Why they're there now. Lawrence's voice cracked. Grace, Most of them lost their homes because of my developments. I know, Grace said quietly. You knew? Of course I knew. Grace picked up her spoon again, stirred her oatmeal without eating. I've known for years, Mr. Anderson. Every person I serve, I ask where they're from, what happened, why they need help. Your company's name comes up a lot. Lawrence felt like he'd been punched. Why didn't you say anything? Grace looked at him directly. What would you have done? I would have. Lawrence stopped. He didn't know how to finish that sentence. Because Grace was right. What would he have done? Apologized? Written a check? Made it about his guilt instead of their suffering? You would have made it worse, Grace said, reading his thoughts. You would have tried to fix it with money, turned them into your project, your redemption story, and they would have hated it. Hated you. Hated themselves for needing it. Lawrence covered his face with his hands. I'm so sorry, Grace, for everything, for not seeing, for not caring, for building an empire on people's suffering and never once asking what it cost. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I know you are. I want to make this right. I'll pay your medical bills, all of them. I'll give you a raise, better insurance, whatever you need, and I'll fund Second Horizon, whatever they need. Whatever you think. Mr. Anderson, Grace interrupted gently. Stop. Lawrence looked up. What? Grace set down her spoon, met his eyes with a clarity that made him feel small. Don't try to fix me. Fix what you built. The words hit him like a physical blow. What? I don't need your charity, Grace continued. I don't need your pity. I don't need you to rescue me so you can feel better about yourself. Her voice was calm, but firm. I need you to stop displacing families. Stop pushing people into poverty. Stop building wealth on top of other people's suffering. Lawrence's throat tightened. Grace, I can do both. I can help you and change the business. Grace shook her head. If you help me first, you'll think you've done enough. You'll write the check, pat yourself on the back, and go back to business as usual. I've seen it before. Rich people trying to buy their way out of guilt. It doesn't work. Then what do you want from me? Grace leaned forward slightly, her tired eyes burning with intensity. I want you to dismantle the system that created the problem. I want you to build housing people can afford. I want you to include the community in decisions instead of pushing them out. I want you to treat displaced residents like partners, not obstacles. Lawrence felt tears threatening. That would cost me everything. My investors, my board, my reputation. Good, Grace said simply. Maybe it should. The room went silent except for the beeping monitors. Lawrence stared at this woman in a hospital bed, wearing a thin gown connected to IVs, barely strong enough to feed herself. And she was the most powerful person he'd ever met. Not because of what she had, because of what she refused to accept. She wasn't going to let him buy his way out of this. Wasn't going to let him ease his guilt with charitable donations. She was demanding real change, structural change, the kind that would cost him professionally, financially, personally. I don't know if I can do that, Lawrence whispered. Then you haven't learned anything, Grace said. She picked up her spoon again. And I wasted 9 years working for a man who builds towers but has no foundation. Lawrence stood abruptly, walked to the window, stared out at the Chicago skyline. His skyline, buildings that bore his mark, developments that carried his name. An empire built on numbers that looked perfect on spreadsheets but hid the human cost. He thought about Earl, crying at a community meeting while Lawrence checked his phone. Thought about LaToya, commuting 3 hours because Lawrence's company had priced her out. Thought about Reggie sleeping in his car after serving his country. Thought about Grace, collapsing on his floor because she'd spent years trying to heal damage he kept causing. Fix what you built. Lawrence turned back to Grace. If I do this, I'll lose everything. Grace met his eyes. Then you'll finally understand what the rest of us have been living with. Lawrence left the hospital at 10, drove to his office, sat at his desk staring at financial projections, development timelines, investor presentations, everything he'd built over 15 years, everything that defined him, everything that would have to be torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. His phone buzzed. His development director, Preston. Board meeting at 2. Savannah project needs approval. Lawrence stared at the message. Savannah. Another city. Another neighborhood. Another wave of displacement disguised as progress. He could approve it, move forward, keep building the way he always had. Or he could stop. He opened his calendar, cleared the afternoon, typed a message to his executive assistant. Cancel the board meeting. Reschedule for next week. I need time to prepare something. Prepare what? She replied. A new direction, he typed. Then deleted it. Typed instead, the truth. Lawrence spent the rest of the day alone in his office. Door locked, calls ignored. He pulled up every active development project. Savannah, Boise, Oakland, Sacramento. Calculated the financial impact of stopping them, of restructuring them, of bringing in community partners, of prioritizing affordability over maximum returns. The numbers were brutal. He'd lose investors, lose board members, lose his reputation as a developer who delivered premium returns, lose everything he'd spent 15 years building. But he'd gain something he'd never had: integrity. By evening, Lawrence knew what he had to do, and he knew exactly what it would cost. Everything. The board meeting happened on Monday morning. Lawrence had spent the weekend preparing, not a presentation, a confession. 12 people sat around the conference table. Investors, board members, senior executives, people who'd made millions from Anderson Development's steady returns. They expected good news, approval for Savannah, timeline updates for Boise, projected returns for Oakland. Instead, Lawrence stood at the head of the table and said, "I'm canceling Savannah, Boise, and Oakland, effective immediately." Silence, then chaos. His lead investor, Garrett Monroe, stood up. "You're what?" Lawrence kept his voice steady. "I'm canceling 3 major projects and restructuring everything else." Preston, his development director, looked pale. "Lawrence, we have contracts, commitments, investors depending on these returns." "I know. Then what the hell are you doing?" Garrett's face was red. "We have $48 million committed to Savannah alone, and we'll return it," Lawrence said, "with interest for the inconvenience." The CFO, Bryn Castellano, spoke up. "Lawrence, we don't have the liquidity for that. Returning committed capital plus interest would devastate our reserves." "I know," Lawrence repeated. "We'll liquidate non-essential assets, starting with my personal portfolio." The room exploded, voices overlapping. "Are you having a breakdown? This is corporate suicide. What about our fiduciary responsibility? You'll destroy the company." Lawrence waited for the noise to die down. Then he said quietly, "I've spent 15 years building an empire on other people's suffering. I'm done." Garrett slammed his hand on the table. "This is about that maid, isn't it? The one who collapsed? You're throwing away hundreds of millions because you feel guilty?" "Her name is Grace," Lawrence said. "And yes, she showed me what I've been refusing to see. We've displaced over 2,000 people in Chicago alone, pushed families into poverty, destroyed communities, all so we could deliver premium returns to people who never have to look at the damage." "That's business," Preston said. "Market rate development. It's legal. It's standard practice." "Legal doesn't mean right," Lawrence shot back. "And I'm not doing it anymore." Garrett stood. "I'm calling an emergency vote. Motion to remove Lawrence Anderson as CEO on grounds of breach of fiduciary duty." 3 hands went up immediately, then 2 more, then another. 7 votes, enough to trigger a formal review. Lawrence looked around the table. "Fine, do what you need to do, but I'm still majority shareholder, and I'm using that authority to restructure this company whether you stay or not." By Wednesday, 4 board members had resigned. By Friday, 3 major investors had pulled out, demanding return of committed capital. By the following Monday, news had leaked. Real estate publications ran headlines. Anderson, development cancels major projects. Industry leader faces investor revolt. Chicago developer abandons profit-driven model. Lawrence's phone never stopped ringing. Reporters, lawyers, former colleagues asking if he'd lost his mind. He ignored them all. Instead, he worked. He met with affordable housing advocates, community organizers, non-profit developers, people who'd been building mixed-income housing for years while Lawrence had been maximizing returns. He listened, took notes, asked questions, learned. He created a new model: mixed-income developments. 20% market rate to subsidize 80% affordable. Community land trusts to ensure long-term affordability. Rent stabilization clauses, tenant protections, and most radically, community advisory boards with real decision-making power, not token input, actual authority. He brought the model to Tyrell at Second Horizon, spread the plans across a folding table in the basement. This is what I'm proposing: mixed-income housing, community ownership, residents involved in every decision. Tyrell studied the plans. Who's on these advisory boards? People who've been displaced, Lawrence said. People like Earl, LaToya, Reggie. People who understand what it's like to lose a home. They'll have final approval on designs, rents, tenant selection. Tyrell looked up. You're serious? Completely. Tyrell leaned back. This'll cost you everything. I know. And you're okay with that? Lawrence thought about Grace in that hospital bed, about her words. Don't fix me. Fix what you built. No, but I'm doing it anyway. By December, Lawrence had restructured 3 existing projects using the new model, brought in community partners, established advisory boards. The first meeting happened in a church basement in South Shore. 15 people showed up, including Earl. The old man stared at Lawrence across the table. You're really doing this? I'm trying, Lawrence said. I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I can stop causing more. Earl nodded slowly. All right then, let's get to work. In January, Lawrence visited Grace in her new apartment. He'd insisted she stop working while she recovered. Full pay, full benefits, no arguments. She'd resisted at first, then finally accepted when her doctor said she needed at least 6 months of rest. He brought her the plans for the new model, showed her the advisory board structure, the community ownership framework, the rent stabilization protections. Grace read everything carefully, then looked up. You want me to lead this? It wasn't a question. Yes, Lawrence said. Community impact director, full authority, equal partnership. You'd have final say on every project. Grace shook her head. I'm not qualified for that. You saved 153 people in a war zone. You've been feeding displaced families for 17 years. You're the most qualified person I know. Grace was quiet for a long time, then said, I can't work for you anymore, Mr. Anderson. Not as an employee, not in your house. I know, Lawrence said. That's why I'm offering you a partnership. Not as my employee, as my equal. Grace studied him, her tired eyes searching for sincerity. For truth. Why are you really doing this? Because you were right, Lawrence said simply. I built something broken, and it's my responsibility to fix it. Not for my redemption, for the people I hurt. Grace looked at the plans again, then back at Lawrence. I have one condition. Anything. The people on those advisory boards get paid. Real salaries, not stipends, not token payments. They're doing real work. They get real compensation. Lawrence nodded. Done. And Second Horizon becomes a funded partner. Not a charity case. A full partner, with decision-making authority. Done. And you step back. Let the community lead. Your job is to listen and provide resources, not to control. Lawrence swallowed hard. That was the hardest condition. Giving up control, trusting others, accepting that he didn't have all the answers. Done. Grace finally smiled. Then I'll do it. But not for you, Mr. Anderson, for them. Lawrence felt something break open in his chest. Relief, hope, maybe even redemption. Not earned, but possible. Thank you, Grace. Grace held out her hand. They shook. Not employer and employee, partners. Grace finally said yes. On one condition. That Lawrence stop trying to be the hero of this story and let the people he'd hurt write the ending themselves. Grace started work in March, not at Lawrence's house, at a small office space in Bronzeville, 2 blocks from Second Horizon. Community Impact Director. Her name on the door. No uniform. Just clothes she chose. Comfortable shoes. Reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Lawrence visited on her first day, brought coffee, found her at a desk covered in architectural plans, zoning maps, community feedback forms. She looked up. Mr. Anderson. Lawrence, he corrected. We're partners now. Grace smiled. Old habits. Give me time. The first project launched in South Bend, Indiana, a mixed-income development on a site that had been vacant for 8 years. 40 units, half affordable, half market rate. Community land trust ownership. Advisory board led by 3 displaced residents from Chicago, including Earl. The groundbreaking happened on a warm April morning. Press showed up, local officials, residents. Lawrence stood to the side, watching Grace cut the ribbon alongside Earl. She spoke briefly, thanked the community, thanked the partners. Didn't mention Lawrence once. He was fine with that. This wasn't his story anymore. By summer, a second project broke ground in Oakland. 60 units, mixed income, designed with input from families displaced by previous developments. Child care center on the first floor. Community garden on the roof. Rent stabilization built into every lease. LaToya flew out for the opening, brought her kids, stood with Grace as they planted the first vegetables in the garden. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, things that would grow and feed people, LaToya cried. Grace held her hand. Lawrence watched from the back, throat tight. The third project launched in Milwaukee, a redesigned housing corridor in River West. 80 units, 20% market rate subsidizing 80% affordable. Tenant cooperative ownership. Advisory board, with full veto power over management decisions. Reggie joined that board, moved out of his car, into a studio apartment, started attending meetings, started speaking up, started living again. By fall, Lawrence had divested from most of his luxury developments. Sold properties, returned investor capital. His net worth dropped by 60%. His office shrank from 12 employees to 4. His penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan went on the market. He moved into a modest 2-bedroom in Hyde Park, closer to the work, closer to the people. Some nights he couldn't sleep, worried about money, worried about failure, worried that he'd destroyed his career for a model that might not work. But then he'd remember Grace's words. Fix what you built, and he'd keep going. 1 year after Grace collapsed on his kitchen floor, Lawrence stood in the basement of Second Horizon Outreach at 6:45 on a Friday evening. He wore jeans, a flannel shirt, an apron with the Second Horizon logo. His hands, which used to sign contracts worth millions, now held a ladle. Grace worked beside him, hair tied back, apron stained, smiling as she greeted people by name. Earl, LaToya, Reggie, Byron, Shayna, Deshawn. Faces Lawrence knew now. People he'd learned to see. A young mother approached with 2 children. Grace served them soup. Lawrence handed them bread. The woman thanked them both. Grace squeezed her hand. Lawrence nodded. No speeches. No grand gestures. Just presence. After the meal service ended, after the tables were cleared and the dishes washed and the last person had left with tomorrow's hope in a paper bag, Lawrence and Grace stood outside. October evening. Rain threatening. Streetlights glowing amber. You did good today, Grace said. I'm learning, Lawrence replied. You are. Grace looked at him. Really looked. You're different, Mr. Anderson, Lawrence. I had a good teacher. Grace smiled, then turned serious. You lost a lot this year. Lawrence thought about it. The board members who'd resigned, the investors who'd fled, the colleagues who'd stopped returning calls, the penthouse he'd sold, the reputation he'd sacrificed, everything he'd spent 15 years building, gone. But he'd gained something too. The ability to look people in the eye, the knowledge that his work created homes instead of destroying them, the understanding that wealth without dignity was just numbers on a screen, and relationships, real ones, with Grace, with Tyrell, with Earl and LaToya and Reggie and dozens of others whose names he'd learned, whose stories he'd heard, whose lives he'd stopped treating as obstacles. I lost buildings, Lawrence said finally, but I found people. Grace nodded. That's the trade. They walked to their cars. Grace drove a reliable sedan now, paid for by her salary, fair compensation for real work. Lawrence drove a used truck, practical for visiting project sites. They paused before separating. Same time Monday? Grace asked. Same time, Lawrence confirmed. He drove home through neighborhoods he used to redevelop, past buildings he used to acquire, past communities he used to displace. But tonight, he saw them differently. not as opportunities, as homes, places where people lived, loved, struggled, survived, places that deserved protection, not profit. He parked outside his apartment, 2 bedrooms, modest kitchen, nothing like the penthouse, but it felt more like home than anywhere he'd ever lived, because he'd earned it honestly. Built it on a foundation that could hold weight. Lawrence sat at his small dining table, opened his laptop, reviewed plans for the next development, community feedback, advisory board notes, resident concerns. He read every word, made notes, prepared questions. This was his work now, not designing towers that touched the sky, but building communities that touched the ground. His phone buzzed. A text from Grace, photo attached. Second Horizon's new sign, freshly painted, bright letters. Below it, another sign, funded in partnership with Anderson Community Development. Lawrence smiled. He opened a file on his laptop, financial projections. The numbers weren't impressive anymore. Low returns, thin margins, barely sustainable. But beneath the numbers were other metrics. Families housed, communities stabilized, residents empowered, displacement prevented. Those numbers told a different story, one Lawrence could finally be proud of. His buildings still stood. Across Chicago, across America, towers with his name carved into steel, developments that reshaped skylines. But now, other buildings stood too, modest ones, affordable ones, built with community input, owned by community members, designed for people instead of profit. And those buildings, Lawrence realized, would last longer than any tower, because they weren't built on displacement. They were built on dignity, on partnership, on the belief that everyone deserved a place to call home. Not just the wealthy, everyone. Lawrence closed his laptop, looked around his small apartment, saw Grace's words framed on the wall, a gift she'd given him last month, handwritten on simple paper, "Don't fix me, fix what you built." He'd spent 41 years building wealth, and in 1 year, he'd learned what wealth really meant. Not money, not power, not towers touching the sky, but people standing on solid ground, communities thriving, families safe, home. For the first time in his life, Lawrence Anderson wasn't building wealth. He was building home.